My quiet shop, the Resurrector, was meant to bury a past of shadows and secrets. But the moment a kid with expensive sneakers walked in, that past clawed its way back to life. My shop smells of ozone, old dust, and the faint, coppery tang of dying electronics. It's a narrow little place, wedged between a laundromat that's always steamy and a nail salon that perpetually smells of acetone. The sign outside, the Resurrector, is hand-painted, the letters starting to fade. Most people see a graveyard for forgotten tech. Towers of beige computer cases from the 90s, tangles of cables like metallic spaghetti, and shelves of components that look ancient to anyone under 30. I see potential. I see the ghosts of data that can be recovered, the spark of life that can be coaxed back into a dead motherboard. It's a quiet life, a deliberate one. And after 2 decades of a life that was anything but quiet, I craved the mundane with an almost physical hunger. The thing about my old job, the one I never talk about, is that it rewires your brain. You can leave the company, but it never really leaves you. You still sit with your back to the wall in restaurants. You still clock every person who enters a room, cataloging their shoes, their posture, the weight of their pockets. You notice the subtle shift in a person's breathing when they're about to lie. It's exhausting, which is why I chose this little purgatory of broken gadgets. Here, the only lies I deal with are from people swearing they didn't spill a full cup of coffee on their laptop. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon, a notoriously slow time. The little bell above the door chimed, a sound I usually found charming, but this time it felt like an alarm. I was in the back, meticulously resoldering a pin on a vintage amplifier, but I saw him on the small, grainy monitor I kept on my workbench. He was young, maybe 19, swimming in a grey hoodie with the hood pulled up, though it wasn't cold or raining. Red flag number 1. His sneakers, however, were pristine, expensive, a stark contrast to his otherwise sloppy appearance. Red flag number 2. I came out from the back, wiping my hands on a rag. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, keeping my voice even and calm. He didn't look at me. His eyes were scanning the glass display case where I kept the good stuff. Refurbished phones, high-end headphones I'd brought back from the brink, a couple of rare processors. He was on his phone, held to his ear, but he wasn't talking. Just listening, or pretending to. Red flag number 3. Using a phone as a prop to avoid engagement. "Nah man, just looking," he mumbled, his gaze lingering on a pair of Bose noise-canceling headphones. I'd spent a week on those. The previous owner had dropped them in a puddle, and the internal circuitry was a mess. I'd practically rebuilt them from scratch. They were my masterpiece of the month, priced to sell, but still carrying a piece of my pride. I leaned against the counter, seemingly relaxed, but I was cataloguing everything. The way he shifted his weight to his left foot, subtly angling his body to block my view of the case with his right shoulder. The way his free hand kept twitching, flexing and relaxing inside the pocket of his hoodie. He was an amateur, but a practiced amateur. He'd done this before. He moved around the small shop, feigning interest in a box of assorted power adapters, then a stack of old keyboards. But his path was a slow, deliberate orbit, always bringing him back to the main display case. My shop is small, a single room, but it has blind spots if you don't know where the cameras are. And nobody knows where all my cameras are. The one he'd probably spotted, the old dome camera near the door, was a dummy. The real eyes were hidden in a gutted-out speaker, in a hollowed-out book on a shelf, and in a tiny pinhole lens right above the main display. A little bit of leftover professional paranoia. He finally made his move. He gestured with his phone towards the back wall. "You got any of them, HDMI to VGA things?" he asked, his voice a little louder than before, a clear attempt at misdirection. "Aisle 3, I said, pointing to a cluttered shelf not moving from my spot. I watched his eyes. They didn't follow my finger. They darted down to the headphones, then to me, then back to the headphones. The calculation was happening right there in the open. He was weighing the risk. He saw an old man, a dusty shop, a slow Tuesday. He saw an easy mark. "Cool, thanks," he said, and turned his body fully towards the shelf. It was the classic maneuver, the turn, the false focus, the quick grab with the hand you think isn't being watched. I saw his right hand slip out of his pocket. I saw the flash of his fingers as they expertly unlatched the cheap lock on the display case, a lock I really needed to upgrade. I saw him palm the Bose headphones and slide them smoothly inside his jacket. The whole motion took less than 2 seconds. It was slick. I had to give him that. He stood up, turned back to me, and gave a half-hearted shrug. Actually, never mind. Don't see it. I'll just get one online. He started for the door a little too quickly. The confident swagger was back, the smug certainty of a successful predator. He thought he was home free. He pushed the door, the little bell chiming his exit. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I didn't call the police. I just stood there in the sudden silence of my shop, listening to his expensive sneakers fade down the sidewalk. My heart wasn't pounding with anger or fear. It was beating with a slow, cold, and deeply familiar rhythm. A feeling I hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling that precedes the hunt. I slowly walked to the door and flipped the sign from open to closed. I locked the deadbolt, the heavy clunk echoing in the room. Then I went to my back office and sat down in front of my real computer, the one not on display. I pulled up the footage, not from the grainy monitor, but from the 4 high-definition, strategically placed feeds. I watched the theft again, this time in crystal-clear detail, frame by frame. I saw the logo on his hoodie, the unique scuff mark on his left shoe, a faint scar above his right eyebrow. Amateurs always leave a trail, but I wasn't looking at any of that. I was looking at his phone. In the high-resolution footage from the pinhole camera, as he'd held the phone to his ear, the screen had been angled just right. For a fraction of a second, it had reflected off the glass countertop, showing me exactly what was on it. He wasn't on a call. He had his social media page open. And a pop-up from my shop's router had appeared on his screen, clear as day. Welcome to the Resurrector Wi-Fi. Connect? His thumb had been hovering right over the connect button. A kid like that, obsessed with his phone and saving his data, would never be able to resist free Wi-Fi. It was an involuntary reflex. I opened my network administration panel. A list of connected devices appeared. Most were mine. But one, a brand new iPhone with a custom name, had connected exactly 7 minutes ago and disconnected 2 minutes ago. I clicked on it, and there it was. His device's unique identifier. Its digital fingerprint. He thought he'd just stolen a pair of $200 headphones. He had no idea he'd just handed me the keys to his entire digital life. The game had changed. He wasn't just a shoplifter anymore. He was my new project. A MAC address is like a fingerprint. It's unique, it's persistent, and if you know how to look, it tells you a story. My old life was all about reading those stories. While most people see a string of hexadecimal characters, I see a breadcrumb trail stretching across the digital landscape. My shop's router had dutifully logged his. It was the first and most critical mistake he'd made. The second was underestimating the old man behind the counter. I ran the address through a few old programs I'd written myself, tools that the private sector would pay a fortune for. They crawl the web, correlating device IDs with login data from unsecured public hotspots, data breaches, and marketing databases sold in the dark corners of the internet. It's a digital form of dumpster diving. It took less than 10 minutes. A username popped up, LeoKicks399. A quick search of that handle opened the floodgates. Instagram, Twitter, a half-forgotten SoundCloud page with 2 terrible rap songs on it. It was him. Leo. 19. Just as I'd guessed. His online persona was a carefully curated fiction. Poses with expensive sneakers he'd probably just tried on in a store. Photos of him leaning against cars that clearly weren't his. Every post was a desperate scream for validation. An attempt to project a life of easy wealth he didn't have. But in the background of a few photos, I saw the truth. The peeling paint of a low-income housing project. The worn-out linoleum floor in what was likely his mother's kitchen. A comment from a girl, probably his sister, begging him to come home for dinner. The kid wasn't a kingpin. He was a pretender, drowning in the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be. Calling the cops would be easy. I had his face, his name, a digital chain of evidence that would lead them right to his door. They'd retrieve my headphones, and he'd get a slap on the wrist, maybe some community service. The cycle would continue. But my instincts, long dormant, were screaming that this wasn't the correct response. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about education. My kind of education. I kept digging. This kid was sloppy. He used the same password for everything. It was a simple matter to access his cloud storage, his emails. I wasn't looking for bank details. I was looking for motive. Tucked away in a folder of deleted messages, I found it. It wasn't about the money, not directly. He'd stolen the headphones on order. The messages were with a user named Z. The tone was different from Leo's usual bravado. It was subservient, nervous. Z was demanding, specific about the model, the condition. He'd promised Leo $500, more than double what I was asking. Enough to make a desperate kid do something stupid. Z's last message was simple and chilling. Don't be late. And don't mess this up, kid. You know what happens if you do. This changed the equation. Leo wasn't the predator. He was the bait, and Z was the real shark. My little shop, my sanctuary of quiet, had been caught in the middle of something uglier than simple theft. And that I couldn't abide. The hunt was no longer just about a pair of headphones. The next day I didn't open the shop. Instead, I sat in my car, a bland gray sedan that blended into any street, parked across from the housing project I'd identified from Leo's photos. I watched him leave his apartment building, headphones in their original box tucked under his arm. He was constantly checking his phone, his body language radiating a panicked energy. He was heading to a meet with Z. I followed him. It was laughably easy. He never once checked his mirrors, never looked over his shoulder. He took a bus downtown to a small park, a sad square of patchy grass and concrete benches. He sat on a bench, bouncing his knee, a rabbit waiting for a fox. 10 minutes later, the fox arrived. Z was older, maybe mid-30s, with a hard face and the kind of dead eyes that told me he'd seen real violence. He wasn't some street punk. He was a professional. He sat down next to Leo, not even bothering with a greeting. "You got it?" he grunted. Leo nervously handed over the box. Z opened it, inspecting the headphones with a critical eye. He looked them over, checking for scratches, testing the hinges. I was parked 100 yards away, watching through a pair of high-powered binoculars. But I was doing more than watching. On my passenger seat was a small, custom-built device, a directional Bluetooth hijacker. I designed it years ago for a very different purpose. It could force a connection to any nearby device. I aimed the small antenna at the park bench and pressed a button. Z put the headphones on, no doubt to test the active noise cancellation. His posture relaxed slightly as the city noise around him vanished. He nodded, seemingly satisfied. He reached into his jacket, presumably for the money. And that's when I made my move. I hit play on my laptop, which was connected to the hijacker. It wasn't music that flooded into Z's ears. It was a crystal-clear audio file. It was the recording of the message Z had sent Leo just the day before. The sound of his own voice, crisp and clear, saying, "Don't mess this up, kid. You know what happens if you do." I watched through the binoculars as Z's entire body went rigid. His head snapped towards Leo. The look on his face wasn't just anger. It was the cold, terrifying fury of a man who believed he'd just walked into a trap. He ripped the headphones off, his eyes locking onto Leo's. Leo, utterly bewildered, just stared back, his face a mask of pale confusion and dawning horror. He had no earthly idea what had just happened, but he knew, with gut-wrenching certainty, that the simple theft he'd committed had just turned into something far, far worse. And I, sitting comfortably in my car, had just handed him over. Z didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. The most dangerous men rarely do. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, his hand shooting out and grabbing Leo by the front of his hoodie, yanking him up from the bench. Leo stumbled, his eyes wide with a terror that was now pure and undiluted. The easy $500 had vanished, replaced by the immediate prospect of real, physical pain. Z's face was inches from the kid's, his voice a low, venomous hiss that I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. Words like cops, setup, and rat were likely being used. This was the part of the operation where things could go sideways. It was one thing to manipulate a situation from a distance, another to see the visceral, unpredictable reality of human fear up close. But I'd factored this in. Z was a professional, and professionals don't get their hands dirty in a public park in broad daylight unless they have no other choice. His priority would be information, not retribution, at least not yet. He shoved Leo hard, propelling him towards a black sedan parked at the curb, the kind with tinted windows that absorbed the light. A second man I hadn't seen before got out of the driver's seat. He was built like a refrigerator, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they could crush coconuts. He opened the back door, and Z bundled the terrified kid inside. The door slammed shut, and the car pulled away from the curb smoothly, disappearing into traffic. They hadn't even bothered to take the headphones, which lay abandoned on the park bench. Phase 2 was now in motion. I'd attached a micro GPS tracker to the inside of the headphone box before Leo had left his apartment. It was a simple trick. I'd logged into his public cloud storage and found an email confirming a delivery. Using that info, I'd called the building's superintendent, pretending to be from the courier service, and told him a package had been misdelivered and needed a new label. He'd let me into the mailroom without a second thought. I found Leo's package, a new pair of sneakers, and while I fixed the label, I slipped the tracker into the Bose box he had sitting on his table. He'd been so focused on the meat, he hadn't noticed. Now, on my laptop screen, a small red dot was moving steadily across the city map. They weren't heading for a warehouse district or some abandoned industrial park. They were heading for the financial district, towards one of the gleaming glass towers that housed hedge funds and corporate law firms. This was unexpected. The red dot finally stopped, blinking patiently from the rooftop of the Sterling Thorn Tower, a 50-story monument to modern capitalism. Z wasn't just a street-level thug. He was connected. I drove to a parking garage 3 blocks away and took the stairs to the roof. From there I had a clear line of sight to the Sterling Thorn Tower. I pulled out my long-range audio detector, a device that looks like a futuristic rifle, but is, in essence, a hypersensitive microphone combined with a laser. By bouncing a laser off a window, it can detect the micro-vibrations caused by sound waves inside the room and translate them back into audible conversation. It was old company tech, but it still worked beautifully. I focused the laser on a top-floor office window, the one closest to where the GPS signal was originating. I put on my earpiece and listened. At first there was just muffled noise. Then Leo's voice high-pitched and trembling. I swear, I don't know anything. He was just some old guy in a repair shop. Then Z's voice, cold and flat. An old guy in a repair shop who somehow recorded my private message and played it back in your ear. Try again. A new voice entered the conversation, smooth and articulate with an accent I couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe. Let him go, Z. He's telling the truth. He's a pawn. A stupid one, but a pawn nonetheless. There was a moment of silence. I could hear the faint, terrified whimpers of the kid. The new voice continued, its calmness more menacing than Z's overt aggression. The question is not about the boy. The question is, who is the player who moved him? This old man is not what he seems. Our operation has been compromised. The device you brought me, he must have been referring to the headphones, has been tamed. Someone got to it. What do you want me to do? Z asked. Find him, the calm voice ordered. Find this old man in his dusty little shop. Find out who he is. Find out who he works for. And then, erase the problem. Permanently. Bring the boy with you. He can identify the shop. My blood ran cold. This had escalated far beyond a simple lesson for a teenage shoplifter. I had stumbled into something big, something organized. These weren't just criminals. They were intelligence professionals of some kind. They talked like my old colleagues, and their solution to a problem was the same: elimination. I had inadvertently put a target not only on my own back, but on Leo's as well. The boy was now a loose end, a witness they couldn't afford to leave behind. I packed up my equipment, my mind racing. They would be on their way to my shop now, to my quiet sanctuary. I had to get there first. I had to prepare. As I hurried back to my car, my phone buzzed with an alert. It was from a silent tripwire I'd set up on my shop's network. Someone was trying to brute force their way past my firewall. They were sophisticated, using masking protocols I hadn't seen in years. They weren't just coming to break down the door. They were trying to get a digital look inside first to assess the threat. They knew I wasn't just some old man. They were treating me like a professional. And that meant their response would be professional too. Swift, efficient, and lethal. I got in my car and sped out of the garage, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse. The mouse had just realized the cat was a tiger, and the game was now about survival. The drive back to my shop was a blur of calculated risks and traffic laws I selectively ignored. My quiet life had evaporated, replaced by the familiar, acrid taste of adrenaline. They were coming for me, and they were bringing Leo, which meant I had two objectives: survive and get that kid out alive. He was a fool, but he didn't deserve to be erased for it. My hubris had put him in this position. My skill had to get him out. I pulled into the alley behind my building and entered through the reinforced steel door in the back, bypassing the quaint, bell-adorned front entrance. The moment I was inside, I engaged the lockdown sequence. Heavy magnetic locks slammed into place on all doors and windows. Steel shutters I'd installed years ago rolled down over the glass, plunging the shop into a dim, artificial twilight. To anyone outside, it would look like an impenetrable metal box. To me, it was now the arena. They were already probing my network, but my firewall was a custom build, a labyrinth of my own design. It would hold them for a while. It gave me time. I moved quickly, my actions born of muscle memory I thought I'd shed. From a false bottom crate of old monitors, I pulled out a small, heavily modified server rack and powered it on. The quiet hum was a comforting sound. I didn't have weapons in the traditional sense. Guns were messy, loud, and left a trail. My weapons were quieter. I pulled up the live feeds from the pinhole cameras I had hidden on the building's exterior. A black sedan, the same one from the park, pulled up across the street. Z and the refrigerator-sized driver got out, dragging a visibly terrified Leo between them. The third man, the calm voice, was nowhere to be seen. He was the strategist, the one who wouldn't risk being on the front line. "That's the place," I heard Leo's muffled voice say through my parabolic mic aimed at the street. Z shoved him forward. "Go, knock on the door. Get him to open it." I watched on the monitor as the boy stumbled towards my front door, his face streaked with tears. He was bait, and he knew it. I couldn't open the door, but I could talk to him. I patched my voice through a tiny speaker hidden in the old dummy camera dome. "Leo, step away from the door. Walk towards the laundromat." He froze, his head snapping up. On the street, Z and his partner tensed, looking around for the source of the voice. "Do it now, Leo," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is your only way out of this." For a heart-stopping second, he hesitated. Then he bolted, sprinting towards the laundromat next door. Z shouted in frustration and started after him, but it was too late. I'd already called the owner of the laundromat, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, and told her a terrified young man was about to run into her shop and that she should lock the door behind him and call the police. No questions asked. I heard the door slam shut just as Z reached it. He was locked out. Now it was just me and them. The refrigerator started working on the front door with a crowbar, the screech of metal on metal echoing down the street. It wouldn't hold forever. I went back to my server. Their hacker was good, but I knew my own system better. I let his probe get through one layer of my firewall, then another, leading him down a digital garden path. I made him think he was winning. As he tunneled deeper, he tripped a data snare I'd laid. Instantly, my system began a counter-assault, not to block him, but to copy him. It mirrored his entire hard drive, downloading everything: his identity, his location, his files, all while he thought he was breaking into mine. On the street, the big man finally broke the lock on the front door, but it was useless against the internal steel shutters. Z, impatient, pulled out a small device and attached it to the shutter. A thermite charge. Amateurs. The heat would fry every piece of delicate electronics in the front of my shop. "Bad move," I muttered to myself. I typed a final command and the trap sprung. The hacker's screen, wherever he was, would now be filled with a single image. the official seal of the Central Intelligence Agency, along with a scrolling message. Active intrusion detected on a secure U.S. government server. Your location is triangulated. A tactical team is en route. Do not attempt to flee. It was a complete and utter lie, of course. My connection to the agency had been severed for years. But they didn't know that. Panic is a more effective weapon than any bullet. Simultaneously, as the thermite charge on my door began to glow cherry red, I triggered my shop's last line of defense, the fire suppression system. But it wasn't loaded with water. It was loaded with Halon 1301, a potent oxygen-displacing gas, and a few chemical additives of my own invention, designed to aggressively corrode metal and plastic. The thermite burned through the shutter. A cloud of dense white gas billowed out of the new opening, enveloping Z and his partner. They coughed, stumbling back, but it wasn't tear gas. It was worse. I watched on my cameras as the finish on their sedan began to bubble and peel. The plastic on their sidearms started to warp. Z pulled out his phone to make a call, but the screen flickered and died, the corrosive agent attacking the delicate circuitry. They were digitally and mechanically neutered, standing in the middle of a chemical dead zone. Sirens wailed in the distance Mrs. Gable had come through. Z and his partner exchanged a panicked look, abandoned their melting car, and fled on foot, disappearing into the night. I sat back in my chair, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. The front of my shop was a wreck, but I was alive, and more importantly, so was the kid. I looked at the data I'd copied from their hacker. It was a treasure trove. Names, bank accounts, encrypted communications. This wasn't just some local crew. They were part of an international syndicate specializing in stealing and scrubbing proprietary technology for foreign powers. The Bose headphones weren't for listening to music. They were a test, a low-level acquisition to vet a new recruit. Leo had unknowingly tried to enlist in a world of industrial espionage. I packaged all the data into an anonymous, encrypted file. I sent one copy to a former colleague at Langley with the subject line, "A loose thread you might want to pull." I sent another to a journalist I knew who had a reputation for taking down giants. The calm-voiced man in the tower would have bigger problems than a dusty repair shop now. His entire organization was about to be dismantled from the inside out. An hour later, after the police had come and gone, taking a bewildered Leo for questioning, I stood in the ruined doorway of my shop. The ozone smell was stronger than ever. Leo was safe. He'd get charged with shoplifting, but with a good lawyer one I would anonymously pay for, he'd likely get probation, and a scare he would never forget. A very expensive education. I picked up the abandoned Bose headphones from the park bench where the police had left them. The casing was scuffed, but the internals were fine. I took them to my workbench in the back, picked up my soldering iron, and began to work. The quiet life I'd built had been shattered, but as I focused on the delicate circuitry, bringing the dead back to life, I realized something. Maybe I wasn't meant for a completely quiet life after all. Maybe, every once in a while, the resurrector needed to resurrect more than just old electronics.